Hello, it's Claudio, and in this tutorial you will see how to convert a tuple to a string in Python. The simplest method to convert a tuple to a string in Python is with the string join method that generates a string by concatenating the strings in a tuple. This works fine if the elements of the tuple are strings. Otherwise, an alternative approach is required, for example by using the map function. Let's say I have the following tuple of strings. To convert this tuple into a single string, we can use the string join method that concatenates the strings in an iterable and creates a single string. In this case, our iterable is a tuple, but it could also be a list or a set. As you can see, we have applied the join method to an empty string that acts as a delimiter between each character in the final string. That's why we see the word CodeFather as a single string. To convert this string back to a tuple, we have to split our string into a tuple of characters. To do that, we can use the tuple function. There might be also scenarios in which you would like to use the comma as separator when converting a tuple into a string. For example, let's take a tuple that contains the name of planets. If we use the join method in the same way we have done before, we get the following string. To make it readable, we want to have a comma between each string in the tuple. As you can see, we can pass a different delimiter as string to which we apply the join method. Also, for a cleaner code, we can store the delimiter into a variable. This can be handy in case we want to change the delimiter later on. Now, let's see what happens if we apply the join method to a tuple that contains a mix of strings and integers. The Python interpreter tells us that the element of the tuple identified by index 1 should be a string, but it's an integer instead. The problem comes from the fact that the join method can only be applied to strings. So to make this work, we have to convert any numbers in the tuple into strings first. And to do that, we can use a list comprehension. The list comprehension converts our tuple into a list where every item is a string. Then the list is passed to the join method. To clarify how this works, if you are not familiar with list comprehensions, you can see this output that shows what the list comprehension generates. The same applies if our tuple contains floats. We get an exception when trying to use the join method directly. As an alternative, we can use the same list comprehension used before. Now, instead of using a list comprehension, we will see how to use the map function to convert a tuple of numbers into a string. If we pass the str function as first argument and our tuple as second argument, we get the following. We can actually pass this map object to the tuple function to see the difference between this object and the original tuple. Notice how this time every element of the tuple is a string instead of a float. And finally, let's use map together with join to create a string from our tuple of numbers. And now let's move to a different topic. Let's find out how to convert a tuple of bytes to a string. The bytes function can be used to return a bytes object. It can also be used to convert objects, for example a tuple, into bytes objects. Here are some things that we can do with the bytes function. We can generate a bytes object with length 5 filled with zeros, or for example, we can generate a bytes object using the range function. But here we want to see how to convert a tuple of bytes into a string. Here you can see how we can generate the same bytes object we have created using the range function, but this time by starting from a tuple. The conversion of tuples into string can also be useful with dates. I have a tuple with 3 elements, where the first element represents the day of the month, the second element represents the month, and the third element the year. Let's find out how we can convert this tuple into a string that shows the full date. To do that, we will look at the Python datetime module. The method accepts year, month, and day, and generates a date object. Let's try to pass the first item of our tuple to it and see what happens. The Python interpreter is expecting the month in position 2. So let's pass the month and see what happens. Now the date method is expecting the day in position 3. Something is not right. This is not what I wanted, considering that in our tuple, the day is the first element. Let's see if I can call the date method by using keyword arguments. If you want to know more about keyword arguments, and especially about args and kwargs, have a look at the link in the description below. So here is how the call to the date function changes when we use keyword arguments. Now, let's store this object into a variable and then print the string associated to it. To do that, we will use the datetime.ctime function. Now we will move to something else. I want to see how to convert a list of numeric tuples to a list of string tuples. We start from the following list of tuple, and I want to generate a list of tuples where every item in a tuple is a string instead of a number. In the first approach, we use a for loop that reads each tuple in the list and converts it into a tuple of strings using the map function. Each tuple is then added to the new data list using the list append method. Let's have a look at the second approach. This time we will use a list comprehension. We will start from the following code from the previous example where we use the tuple function and the map function. First of all, let's take a single tuple and see what it returns. We are passing a map function to the tuple function, and we are using the str function in the map function to convert every element of the tuple from a number to a string. Now we can use this expression as part of our list comprehension. There is also a third approach. We can also write a one-liner that uses 2 for loops. I'm not a big fan of this one because the code is becoming harder to read. We went through quite a lot of different ways to convert a Python tuple to a string. We've seen how to use the join function, the map function, and list comprehensions. Like this video if you found it useful, and subscribe to CodeFather if you want to watch more Python tutorials in the future.